Juniper here. The night I walked away from my marriage did not involve screaming tears or slammed doors. It happened quietly in a restaurant that once symbolized everything I believed love was supposed to be. Brandon, my husband of 8 years, sat across from me at a small corner table. This was the same place where he had proposed, the same table where he once promised we would grow old together. But tonight, his attention never left his phone. I did not need to ask who he was texting. I already knew. Isabella. The influencer. The woman who had slowly replaced me while I was still legally his wife. I ordered his steak out of habit, not love. He barely noticed. When I told him I was leaving, he just shrugged. That was the moment something inside me went silent. I was not angry. I was simply finished. Drop a comment below. Have you ever stayed silent because you knew your words wouldn't matter anymore? I want to know I'm not the only one who learned the power of silence the hard way. To the outside world, Brandon was a culinary prodigy. Magazines called him the golden boy of the Chicago restaurant scene, a man with an intuitive grasp of atmosphere and taste. They applauded his genius for blending industrial grit with organic warmth. They praised his ability to curate a wine list that felt both sophisticated and accessible. But genius is rarely a solo act. It is usually a collaborative effort, where one person takes the bow and the other takes the notes. For 8 years, I was the one taking notes. I was the one taking measurements. I was the invisible architect of his entire empire. See, Brandon didn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. He couldn't tell a Pinot Noir from a Merlot in a blind taste test. I am a landscape architect by trade. My entire career is built on understanding flow, light, and organic systems. When he opened his first bistro, I was the one who drafted the blueprints. I sourced the reclaimed white oak for the bar that became his trademark. I designed the lighting schematics to flatter diners at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. I negotiated the exclusive contracts with the organic farms that gave his menus their credibility. I wasn't just his wife. I was his uncredited business partner, his head of design, and his supply chain manager. The breaking point wasn't the affair with Isabella, that was just a symptom of his narcissism. The breaking point was the profile in Architectural Digest 3 months ago. I remember standing in our kitchen, reading the glossy pages where Brandon posed in the dining room I had designed, leaning against the mural I had commissioned. The interviewer asked him about his inspiration. Brandon looked at the camera and said, "It just comes to me. I have a vision for how people want to feel, and I manifest it." When asked about me, he smiled that charming empty smile and said, "Juniper? She's my rock. She keeps the home fires burning while I create." He didn't just diminish me, he erased my intellectual property. He took my talent, branded it with his name, and sold it to the highest bidder. That article was the moment I realized I wasn't a partner in a marriage. I was an unpaid employee in a conglomerate of one. And like any smart investor realizing an asset has become toxic, I knew it was time to divest. I didn't hire a divorce lawyer to fight for half of his restaurants. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his debt-leveraged empire. I had my own resources I had kept quiet about, because I didn't want to emasculate him. My grandmother had left me a substantial inheritance, a portfolio of assets and trust funds worth over $14 million. For years, I hadn't touched a cent of it. I lived on my salary, contributing to our joint life, believing we were building something together. I was wrong. I called my broker the morning after the dinner. I gave a single instruction: liquidate. I moved the funds into offshore accounts he couldn't touch or even see. I wasn't leaving with nothing. I was leaving with everything that actually mattered: my capital, my taste, and my vision. Brandon thought he was the source of the magic. He was about to find out that he was just the container. I packed one suitcase. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I left his keys on the counter of the kitchen I designed, right next to the empty space where my belief in him used to be. Valdorcia does not scream for attention. It waits for you to notice it. The landscape is a study in patience, rolling hills of cypress and wheat that have stood for centuries without asking for validation. It was the perfect place to bury the woman I used to be. I didn't rent a villa to cry in. I bought a project. I purchased Vigneto Silencioso, the silent vineyard, 3 days after landing. It was a 14th-century estate that had fallen into ruin, its stone bones aching for a restoration. The vines were ancient Sangiovese, gnarled and overgrown, producing a yield that locals whispered was legendary but unharvested for years. To anyone else, it was a money pit. To me, it was a canvas. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't designing a stage for someone else's performance. I was building a sanctuary. I traded my tailored blazers for linen shirts, and my heels for steel-toed work boots. My days became a rhythm of physical labor that exhausted my body but quieted my mind. I learned the difference between the ache of stress and the ache of effort. Stress is a poison that sits in your chest. Effort is a fire that cleanses your muscles. I spent weeks repairing the dry stone walls that lined the terraces, fitting each rock by hand, calculating load and balance. I pruned the vines myself, cutting away the dead wood to let the green shoots breathe. There is a brutal honesty in agriculture. You cannot charm a vine into growing. You cannot gaslight the soil. You simply do the work, and the earth responds. It was during one of those early evenings, sitting on the terrace with a double espresso, that I realized something profound. I had my phone in my hand. My thumb hovered over the Instagram icon. For 8 years, my nervous system had been wired to monitor Brandon's digital pulse. I would check his stories to see who he was with, check his tags to see who was flattering him, check his posts to ensure the brand image was intact. It was a reflex born of anxiety and management. But tonight, my thumb stopped. I realized I didn't care. I didn't care if he was posting photos of Isabella. I didn't care if his new menu was a disaster or a triumph. I didn't care if he was happy or miserable. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more dangerous to a narcissist. It was the luxury of indifference. See, we are taught that the opposite of love is hate. But hate is just love's angry cousin. Hate still requires energy. Hate still keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you, dragging their ghost around your house, letting them live rent-free in your head. Indifference is different. Indifference is the emotional equivalent of a closed account. It is the realization that their currency no longer holds any value in your world. Sitting there, watching the Tuscan sun dip below the hills, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of my marriage finally lift. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't plotting his downfall. I was simply drinking my coffee, and he didn't exist in this moment. That silence? That was the most expensive thing I had ever owned. If the soil is honest, the ledger is absolute. There is no hiding in a balance sheet. 2 months into my ownership, I sat down to audit the estate's distribution contracts. The vineyard had been poorly managed, bleeding money, but there was one steady revenue stream, a massive, exclusive export contract for the estate's premium reserve. I traced the routing numbers, I checked the shell company names on the invoices, and then I froze. The invoices led back to a holding company in Illinois, Whitmore Hospitality Group. I sat back in my chair, the irony washing over me like cold water. Brandon's entire restaurant empire, his reputation as a tastemaker, was built on this wine. He marketed it as a secret vintage discovered during his travels. He charged $40 a glass for it. And he had absolutely no idea that the vineyard had changed hands. He didn't know that the signature taste of his brand was now owned by the wife he had replaced. I could have canceled the contract. I could have cut off his supply right then, choking his revenue stream weeks before his wedding. But that would have been petty. And as I established, I am a businesswoman, not a scorned lover. I didn't cancel the shipment, I upgraded it. I called the bottling plant and ordered a design change. No more generic Italian reserve labels. I designed a new label, elegant and sharp, embossed with the name of the estate's new owner, Juniper Estate. I approved the shipment of 300 cases to Chicago, specifically earmarked for the wedding reception. It wasn't just wine. It was a Trojan horse made of glass and grapes. While I was preparing the shipment, Brandon was apparently busy leveraging his future. My old contacts in Chicago, vendors I had cultivated for years, whispered that he was burning cash he didn't have. A $450,000 wedding. Imported peonies flown in from Holland. A drone show. He was trying to buy the respect he felt slipping away. He needed a miracle to keep his investors happy. Instead, he got Arthur. Arthur was Brandon's angel investor, the whale who kept the lights on. He was a man of terrifying intelligence and old money, someone who valued authenticity above all else. He was in Europe scouting assets when he decided to detour to Tuscany. He wanted to see the source of the house red that was the only profitable item on Brandon's menu. He rolled up the driveway in a vintage Alfa Romeo, looking like a man who owned the horizon. I met him in the tasting room. He didn't recognize me at first. I was tanned, wearing work clothes, my hair loose, but he recognized the quality. He swirled the vintage, took a sip, and closed his eyes. "This structure," he said, his voice gravelly. "It's architectural. It reminds me of the layout of the Gilded Table in Chicago. The same balance." "That's because I designed both," I said, setting the bottle down. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He looked at me, really looked at me, piercing through the context of the dusty vineyard to the memory of the silent woman standing next to Brandon at gala dinners. The realization didn't hit him like a truck, it clicked, like a lock. "You're the wife," he stated. "The landscape architect." "The ex-wife," I corrected. "And the owner of this vineyard." We spent the next hour walking the rows. I showed him the soil analysis. I showed him the renovation blueprints for the estate. I spoke about yield and sunlight, not branding and buzzwords. By the time we returned to the cellar, Arthur looked furious. Not at me. At the fraud he had been funding. He saw the pallets of wine stacked by the door, the fresh Juniper Estate labels glinting under the lights. "These are for the wedding?" he asked, tapping a crate with his cane. "The wedding, the reception, and the restaurants," I said. "He ordered them weeks ago." "He doesn't look at the invoices, Arthur, he just signs them." Arthur stared at the label bearing my name. A slow, shark-like smile spread across his face. He pulled out his phone. "I wasn't planning on attending," he said, checking his calendar. "I hate weddings. They're usually a bad investment. But this? This is going to be educational. The Gold Coast Ballroom does not do subtlety. It does chandeliers the size of small cars and floral arrangements that cost more than a teacher's annual salary." Brandon had spent $450,000 to turn the room into a shrine to his own ego. Isabella was broadcasting every second of it to her 2 million followers. She wanted the world to see her fairy tale. She wanted viral. She was about to get it, just not the genre she expected. I didn't need a spy in the room. I had a front row seat from my terrace in Tuscany, watching the live stream on my tablet. I saw the waiters pouring the dark red wine into crystal glasses. I saw the guests swirling it, nodding, impressed by the complexity. I saw Brandon working the room, his smile tight, his eyes darting toward the door, waiting for Arthur. He didn't just want Arthur's blessing. He needed Arthur's checkbook. He was leveraged to the hilt, gambling that this wedding would cement his status as a hospitality mogul and secure the next round of funding. Arthur arrived late, impeccable in a tuxedo that fit better than Brandon's rented personality. He took his seat at the head table. Brandon practically sprinted over, eager to play the gracious host, pouring Arthur a glass of the vintage himself. He had no idea he was pouring his own obsolescence. When the speeches began, the room quieted. The best man made a joke about Brandon's work ethic. The maid of honor cried about Isabella's beauty. And then, Arthur stood up. He didn't tap his glass. He simply walked to the microphone, taking the bottle of wine with him. The room fell silent out of respect for his money, not his charm. Brandon beamed, expecting the validation he craved. He thought this was the moment the check would clear. "I am a man who invests in vision," Arthur began, his voice booming through the speakers and across the Atlantic to me. "I back people who create things that are real. Authenticity is the only currency that matters in this business." He held up the bottle. The label caught the light. Juniper Estate. "I spent the last week in Italy," Arthur continued, turning the bottle so the camera and Brandon could see the embossing. "I went to find the source of this incredible vintage, the soul of this restaurant empire, and I found it. But I didn't find Brandon." Brandon's smile faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "I found the true architect," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto Brandon. I met the new owner of this vineyard. The woman whose taste built this menu. Whose design built this room. Whose labor created the very wine you are drinking tonight. He raised the glass. To the true talent behind the Whitmore name. To the woman who walked away with the genius, leaving behind nothing but the noise. To Juniper. The silence in the ballroom wasn't peaceful, it was a vacuum. You could see the precise moment the words hit Brandon. It wasn't confusion anymore, it was recognition. He looked at the bottle, he looked at the label he had ignored for weeks. Juniper, my name, on his table, in his glass. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the tastemaker. He was just the reseller, and his supplier had just publicly claimed ownership of his success. There is a concept in psychology called the glass house of the narcissist. From the outside, it looks spectacular. It reflects the light. It dazzles the eye. And it appears to be a fortress of success. But a glass house has no load-bearing walls. It doesn't support itself. It relies entirely on the reflection of others to exist. For 8 years, I was the structural integrity that kept Brandon's glass house standing. I was the one who reinforced the beams and polished the windows. When I left, the structure became fragile. But when Arthur spoke, he didn't just throw a stone. He shattered the foundation. Brandon didn't react with the grace of a businessman facing a crisis. He reacted with the primal panic of a man whose reality is dissolving. He stood up so fast his chair clattered backward onto the parquet floor. His face wasn't red, it was purple. "That's a lie!" he screamed, his voice cracking, losing all its curated baritone smoothness. "She didn't create anything. I made her. I built this." He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur, then at the camera Isabella was still holding. The livestream was capturing every frame of his disintegration. The comments scrolling up the side of my screen shifted instantly from goals and dream wedding to, "What is happening? And is he drunk?" Brandon couldn't stand the sight of the bottles. Those elegant labels bearing my name were mocking him from every table. They were physical proof that he was obsolete. In a fit of blind rage, he didn't just yell, he lunged. He swept his arm across the head table, violently clearing the surface. He didn't break a champagne glass. He smashed the wine bottles. 3 magnums of Juniper Estate Reserve crashed onto the floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Dark, rich, red wine, my wine. The product of my sweat and the Tuscan soil exploded outward. It soaked the white tablecloths. It splattered across the imported peonies. And it splashed onto Isabella's custom couture gown, staining the white silk with the color of fresh arterial blood. Isabella screamed. It was a high, thin sound that cut through the room. She dropped her phone, but she didn't turn the stream off. The camera landed face up on the carpet, broadcasting a tilted, chaotic angle of the groom destroying his own reception. "It's mine!" Brandon roared, grabbing another bottle by the neck, looking around the room like a cornered animal. "The taste is mine. The brand is mine." But the room wasn't listening to his words. They were watching a liability. I saw Arthur stand up. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed, like an investor realizing he had bought a counterfeit. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, looked at Brandon with cold pity, and walked out. That was the signal. The other investors, the bank representatives, the suppliers I knew were in the room. They all stood up. They weren't staying for cake, they were fleeing a sinking ship. I watched it all from my terrace in Italy, 4,000 miles away. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't just a bad wedding toast. It was a total system failure. Brandon had spent his life believing he was the sun, and I was just a satellite. He never understood that I was the gravity holding him together, and without gravity, things don't just fall, they fly apart. 2 weeks later, my phone rang. It wasn't a text or a DM, it was a standard voice call. The caller ID said Brandon. It was 2 in the morning in Chicago, which meant he wasn't sleeping. I was in my garden, inspecting the olive trees, feeling the Tuscan sun warm my shoulders. I didn't answer out of pity. I didn't answer out of curiosity. I answered because I am the CEO of Juniper Estate, and I handle business inquiries efficiently. Hello, Brandon, I said. My voice was level, devoid of the friction that used to define our arguments. I need the contract, he said. No hello, no apology for the wedding disaster, no explanation for the viral videos of him screaming at a bottle of wine. Arthur pulled the funding. The banks are calling in the loans. I can't open the new location without the supply chain guarantee. I need the wine, Juniper. It was pathetic, but it was also clarifying. Even at rock bottom, he saw me as a resource, a lever he could pull to fix his mistakes. He thought he could negotiate with me because he still believed we were playing a game of emotional leverage. He didn't realize I had left the game entirely. I reviewed your account status this morning, I said, flipping through a mental file. Your credit rating has been downgraded to junk status. Your primary investor has publicly disavowed the brand. You have no liquidity. I can fix it, he snapped, the old arrogance trying to claw its way out of the desperation. I just need the inventory. If I have the signature vintage, I can bring the customers back. You owe me this. I built you. You didn't build me, I corrected, my tone as cool as the cellar air. You leveraged me. And now, you are a liability. I took a sip of my own reserve. Juniper Estate does not enter into contracts with insolvent entities. It's a risk management decision. The supply chain is closed, Brandon. Permanently. I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't wait for the screaming or the begging. I pressed the red button. End call. It wasn't an act of cruelty, it was a business decision. And just like that, the final thread was cut. There is a philosophy I have come to live by, something I call the empire of silence. We are taught that revenge must be loud. We think it needs to look like a confrontation, a slap, or a public takedown. But true revenge is architectural. It is the act of building a life so solid, so magnificent, and so complete that your enemy has to crane their neck just to see the foundation of what you have created. I didn't burn Brandon's house down. I simply took back the bricks I had lent him and built my own castle. He is back in Chicago, surrounded by the noise of his own failure. I am here, standing in the silence of my vineyard, watching the grapes ripen in the sun. I don't need to shout to be heard. My name is on the bottle, my legacy is in the soil, and my life? It finally belongs to me. If this story reminded you that your worth is non-negotiable, hit that like button, share this with the friend who needs to stop explaining herself to people who don't listen, and tell me in the comments, what are you building in silence right now?